I never imagined something so terrifying could happen on an ordinary night. It was a quiet Friday, and I decided to order food through a delivery app, just like I did almost every week. I was home alone, enjoying some downtime after a long, tiring day. When the delivery driver arrived, I buzzed him in through the intercom and went downstairs to pick up my order. I opened the door just a crack, as I always did, and at first he seemed completely normal. He handed me the bag, but as I was about to close the door, he stuck his foot in the doorway, stopping me from shutting it. My heart raced. He started pushing the door with force, trying to get inside, while I desperately struggled to keep it closed. His strength was far greater than mine, and within seconds, he forced his way into my home. I dropped the bag and ran toward my phone, which was on the table in the living room. I tried to call the police, but he was quicker. He grabbed the phone out of my hands and smashed it to the floor with such force that it shattered. Panic took over. I started screaming as loudly as I could, hoping that anyone, would hear me. He lunged at me, grabbing my arms as I kept yelling and thrashing to break free. I didn't know if anyone could hear me, but I had no choice but to keep trying to draw attention. My screams echoed through the house, but I couldn't tell if anyone outside could hear them. He kept shouting at me to be quiet, gripping me tightly, but I refused to stop fighting. Suddenly, I heard voices outside. It was my neighbors. They had clearly heard the commotion. The man hesitated for a moment, realizing he wasn't as safe as he thought. He let go of me and tried to make a run for the door, but it was too late. As soon as he opened it, he was met by at least 4 neighbors, all ready to intervene. Mr. Roberts, who lives across the street, was the first to grab him. The delivery driver tried to resist, but the other neighbors quickly stepped in to pin him down. While they held him to the ground, Mrs. Collins, the elderly lady next door, ran into my house and grabbed the landline phone to call the police. I was still in shock, trembling, trying to process what had just happened. My neighbors kept the man restrained as he yelled, insisting he was innocent and that it was all a misunderstanding. But it was obvious that wasn't true. The police arrived within minutes, thanks to Mrs. Collins's quick call, and took the man away in handcuffs. One of the officers asked if I was okay, but I could barely speak. All I could think about was how much worse the situation could have ended if my neighbors hadn't heard my screams. After the police took him away, my neighbors stayed with me to help me calm down. Mrs. Collins made me tea while Mr. Roberts tried to piece together what had happened. I was still shaken but managed to explain bit by bit. I told them how the delivery driver seemed normal until he suddenly forced his way in. Everyone was outraged, especially since our neighborhood was known for being quiet and safe. I never thought something like this could happen here, Mr. Roberts said, still visibly upset. Despite their support, I couldn't shake the terror, imagining what could have happened if no one had come to help. Later that night, one of the officers returned to take my statement. They asked for details about the driver, the order, and everything that had happened. I told them he didn't seem nervous or suspicious until the moment he tried to get in. The officer mentioned that, unfortunately, incidents like this weren't as rare as people think. He praised my neighbors for their quick action, saying that such situations often end much worse. I could barely process his words, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. But having my neighbors around gave me a small sense of comfort. They stayed with me until late, insisting they wouldn't leave me alone that night, which brought a little relief amid all the chaos. The next morning, the reality of what had happened hit me hard. My home, which had always been my safe space, now felt different. Every sound and shadow made me jump, as if he might come back at any moment. I called the delivery app's customer support, explained what had happened, and provided all the details of the order. They said they would investigate, but their response felt more procedural than genuinely concerned. All I wanted was to ensure that no one else would go through what I had experienced. Meanwhile, one of the officers called to let me know the man had a history of minor offenses, but nothing as serious as an attempted home invasion. That made it even scarier. Why had he decided to do something like that night? Was it planned, or did he just act on impulse? My neighbors continued to support me in the days that followed. Some of them even organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss improving security, like installing cameras and setting up a quick communication network. While their solidarity was comforting, it was still hard to feel normal again. Every time I saw a delivery driver in the neighborhood, my chest tightened, and I felt like I was reliving that night all over again. I knew I couldn't let fear control my life, but it was impossible to ignore what had happened. I stopped using delivery apps and avoided opening the door to strangers altogether. The impact of that night stayed with me, and even with the support of my neighbors, I couldn't help but feel vulnerable in my own home. As the days went by, I slowly began to regain a sense of normalcy, but the thought of someone trying to break into my home lingered. I received a call from the police informing me that the man had been formally charged with attempted burglary and home invasion, thanks to my neighbor's statements and mine. Knowing he was in custody brought some relief, but it also made me reflect on how much my safety that night depended on the people around me. My neighbor's quick actions made all the difference, and I was deeply grateful not to be as alone as I had thought. Still, I started rethinking my habits, like double-checking locks, installing a doorbell camera, and avoiding situations that might leave me feeling exposed. Although time has passed, the experience taught me a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the importance of staying alert and relying on your community. The neighbors who came to my rescue that night turned what could have been a horrifying outcome into a story of resilience and support. To this day, I still hesitate before opening the door when I'm home alone, and I probably won't order from a delivery app without some level of apprehension. But that night also showed me that, even in moments of fear, the people around us can turn terror into strength, and that's something I'll carry with me forever. It was supposed to be a normal evening. After an exhausting day at work, I decided to order food through a delivery app. I picked a new restaurant that had recently appeared on the list, something that seemed interesting. Homemade food, good reviews, nothing out of the ordinary. When the delivery arrived, I noticed something strange right away. A strong, almost chemical smell coming from the packaging. At first, I thought it might be the plastic or some unfamiliar seasoning. I opened the container, and the food looked normal, but the smell still bothered me. I felt uneasy. Even so, I left the plate on the table, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling. In the end, I decided not to eat it and threw it all away. Curious about the restaurant, I decided to look it up online. I searched for its name on the app and then on social media. That's when my unease turned into suspicion. The restaurant was run by someone I knew, a former acquaintance from years ago. We weren't mortal enemies, but we'd had a falling out that ended badly. I hadn't thought about him in years and certainly never imagined he still held a grudge. My mind started racing. Could this be a coincidence? Did he know I had placed the order? Or worse, was that strange smell not just in my head? I couldn't sleep that night, so I decided to get to the bottom of it. The next morning, I went to the restaurant in person. I arrived around noon, when the place was just starting to get busy. It was small, with simple decor, and the aroma of the food being prepared smelled different from what I'd experienced the night before. As soon as I walked in, I saw him, the chef, my old acquaintance, standing behind the counter. He recognized me immediately, and his smile felt more like a challenge than a greeting. I tried to stay calm and directly asked him about the strange smell in the food I'd received. He feigned surprise, insisting that the restaurant only used fresh ingredients and that nothing like this had ever happened before. The conversation quickly became tense. He denied any issues and even implied that I might be trying to ruin the restaurant's reputation. That accusation made my blood boil, but I tried to keep my composure. The tension was unbearable. Other customers began noticing the argument, and one of the waiters approached to try to defuse the situation. After a lot of back and forth, I decided to leave, frustrated and without answers. But as I was walking out, something unexpected happened. One of the staff followed me outside and asked to speak with me privately. He seemed nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder as if afraid of being seen. "Look, I don't know what's going on between you and the chef, but he made me put something in your food," he whispered. My heart started racing. I asked what it was, but he said he didn't know, only that the chef had provided the substance. The employee seemed as scared as I was, and that only heightened my sense of danger. I went home, still trying to process what the employee had told me. The idea that someone might have intentionally tampered with my food was as absurd as it was terrifying. I thought about confronting the chef again, but it didn't make sense to return to the restaurant, especially after hearing the employee's confession. My priority was to understand what had happened and ensure no one else was at risk. I called a friend who works in healthcare and explained the situation. He told me not to take any chances and urged me to go straight to the police. Following his advice, I gathered what little evidence I had, the employee's confession and the order details from the app, and went to the police station that same day. At the station, the officer who took my statement listened intently. I explained my history with the chef, the strange smell of the food, and the employee's admission that he had been forced to tamper with my order. The officer asked questions about what might have been added, but I didn't have any answers. At first, he seemed skeptical, but when I mentioned the restaurant's name and the employee's confession, he assured me they would investigate. Still, he cautioned that without concrete proof, it might be difficult to take action against the chef. Despite that, I felt slightly more at ease knowing I'd taken a step to protect myself. As I filled out the report, I realized this was about more than an old grudge. After filing the report, I went home, but the anxiety didn't go away. My mind kept replaying the employee's words. Why had he seemed so scared? And what exactly had he put in the food? The fact that I hadn't eaten anything was my only source of comfort, but I couldn't stop thinking about how many others might be at risk. The next day, the police called me. They said they had visited the restaurant and questioned the chef. But, as expected, he denied everything. They reported that the establishment appeared to be in compliance with health regulations, but that didn't rule out what had happened to me. The officer encouraged me to remain vigilant and promised to look further into the matter. Meanwhile, I started worrying about the employee who had confided in me. He had clearly gone against the chef's orders by telling me what happened, and that could put him in danger. I decided to return to the restaurant, not to confront the chef, but to find the employee and talk to him again. When I arrived, I noticed he was no longer there. I asked one of the waiters, who told me the employee had quit the night before without giving much of an explanation. This only deepened my suspicions that something was seriously wrong. Without his direct testimony, I knew it would be even harder to prove what had happened. Learning that the employee had quit made me even more uneasy. He seemed like the only person willing to expose the truth about what was going on at the restaurant. I contacted the police again and informed them about his departure, suggesting they try to locate him for a formal statement. However, they explained that without more concrete evidence, it would be difficult to advance the case. It was frustrating, but I knew I couldn't give up. I began monitoring the restaurant's reviews and spoke with locals to see if anyone else had experienced something suspicious. For now, there were no new reports, but the sense of helplessness was overwhelming. Over time, I realized the only thing that had protected me that night was my intuition not to eat the food. If I had ignored the strange smell or dismissed the warning signs, the outcome could have been entirely different. The restaurant continued operating, and the chef, my old adversary, was never formally accused of anything. But the fear from that experience still lingers. Now, I think twice before trusting any place or person preparing food for me. What bothers me most is the what if. What if the employee hadn't spoken to me? What if I had eaten the food? I may never have all the answers, but one thing is certain. The feeling that I narrowly escaped something terrible is something I will never forget. I've done hundreds of deliveries, some to places so remote that they barely seem to exist on the map. So when I got an order for a house at the end of a dirt road, I wasn't too surprised. It was nighttime and the area seemed quiet, but something about the place felt off. The house was old, with boarded-up windows, and there was only a faint light on the porch. The customer had left a note in the app asking me to leave the food at the door and not knock. But when I arrived, he was already waiting outside. At first glance, he seemed like an ordinary guy, wearing a cap and a heavy jacket, but something about the way he looked at me made me uneasy. He seemed nervous, glancing around as he approached to grab the food. It wasn't until he stepped into the light that I realized why he looked so familiar. Then it hit me. I'd seen his face on the news just a few days earlier in a report about a man wanted in the area for robberies and suspected homicide. My heart started racing. It was him, the same face, the same intense gaze. I tried to act normal, handing him the bag and preparing to leave as quickly as possible. But he noticed the flicker of recognition in my expression. Before I could step back, he grabbed my arm tightly. "You're not going anywhere," he said in a low, firm voice. In that moment, I knew I had to find a way to get out of there before things escalated. He pulled me inside the house, slamming the door shut behind us. The air was thick with the smell of mold and cigarette smoke, and the room was cluttered with boxes and plastic bags, as if he was getting ready to leave in a hurry. "You saw something you shouldn't have," he said, shoving me into a corner. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. I kept silent, trying not to provoke him, while he paced back and forth, clearly trying to decide what to do with me. All I could think about was how to get out of there. He took my phone from my pocket and tossed it onto a table. "No cops. You're staying here until I figure this out." While he was distracted, I began scanning the room. The nearest window was boarded up, and the door was secured with a heavy latch. But I noticed another door at the back, probably leading to the kitchen or the yard. I knew I had to act fast. When he turned his back to rummage through a backpack, I seized the opportunity. I bolted for the back door, shoving it open with all my strength. I managed to unlock it and get outside, but he realized what was happening and started shouting. Adrenaline kicked in, and I ran as fast as I could into the darkness, ignoring the branches scratching my face and the sharp stones beneath my feet. I sprinted down the dirt road without looking back, my heart pounding and my legs burning from the effort. I could hear his footsteps gaining on me, along with his voice yelling, "Come back here, or it'll be worse for you." The darkness made it hard to see where I was going, but I kept running, focused on the faint glow of a streetlight up ahead. Finally, I reached the main road and spotted headlights approaching from the opposite direction. Waving my arms frantically, I signaled for the driver to stop. Thankfully, the car slowed down. Gasping for breath, I quickly explained what had happened, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The driver told me to get in and locked the doors as soon as I did. The driver took me straight to the nearest police station. During the ride, I managed to calm down enough to give a clearer account of what had happened. Once we arrived, I went directly to the officers and recounted everything. The man's face, the address of the house, and what he said while he held me there. They acted quickly, organizing a team to investigate the location. While I waited, still trembling from the ordeal, one of the officers assured me that situations like this weren't common, but that I'd done the right thing by escaping and reporting it. About an hour later, they informed me that they'd found the house abandoned but had collected enough evidence to aid in tracking the man. Knowing he was still out there made me uneasy, but I felt immense relief that I had gotten away. In the following days, the police kept me updated, letting me know they were actively searching for the man and that the evidence collected at the house, including fake IDs and items linked to recent crimes, was helping narrow down their search. Even though I was reassured that steps were being taken, the thought of him still being on the loose kept me on edge. The delivery app was notified by the authorities, and the account tied to the order was suspended, helping trace potential leads. Despite everything, I returned to work, but with a new sense of caution. I now double-check addresses before accepting any delivery. I often think about that night and how differently it could have ended. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, haunted by worst-case scenarios. What if he'd managed to stop me? What if no one had stopped their car on the road? But more than anything, I feel relief that I trusted my instincts and acted quickly. I never thought something like this could happen to me, but it taught me to be more aware and to always trust my gut. Every delivery I make now carries the weight of that experience. And while I've returned to the job, I'll never approach an isolated route the same way again.